Hey everybody, thanks for joining me again on my series, Vancouver Chronicles. I just wanted to set up this episode a little bit, West Coast Ultralight. It was actually one of the first serious documentaries I did back in the 80s, 1985. I eventually sold it to CBC and PBS. But back in 85, I shot this with a 3-tube Panasonic industrial video camera with this gigantic 3/4 inch deck. I had the 3/4 inch deck at my feet when I was flying around in the ultralights, and the camera suspended from bungee cords from the frame. It was a lot of fun. In 1990, when I got my first Betacam, my tube Betacam camera, I went out and I updated some of the images, and you'll see quite a difference from the Betacam footage and the original Panasonic footage. Some of the Panasonic footage is actually pretty dicey. The other thing I wanted to talk about was about the safety factor. I spent a lot of time flying around in the front seat of an ultralight, and I felt pretty safe. The machines I were in, the Beaver Ultralights, were actually small airplanes, tubular construction, full 3-axis control. They were really just a small airplane. So I felt pretty safe, and these machines had a 12-to-1 glide ratio, and we were always over farmland almost all the time. So if something happened, if we had a power failure, we could easily land it. So I was pretty comfortable, and I was always flying with instructors or even the owners of the company that designed and built the Beaver Ultralights. And that brings me to my other point about the ultralight sport, the sport of ultralight flying, and the industry. When we did this back in the 80s, people were pretty excited. They thought this sport was really going to take off because they were building these things fairly inexpensive. You could buy a kit, a good ultralight kit, for like $5,000, and the training was a lot cheaper. And they thought it was going to really take off. And I think what they forgot to factor in was the fear factor. Not everybody's cut out to be a pilot, and especially flying around in one of these ultralights, you can see they're wide open, and they're pretty funky. So I think they forgot that not everybody's actually cut out for this kind of adventure. Anyway, it was a lot of fun. I had a lot of fun making it, and I think you'll enjoy watching it. So, cheers.
Watching an ultralight airplane lift gently out of a field harkens back to the early days of flight, when every takeoff and landing advanced the cause of aviation. The fascination they engendered stopped cart and horseless carriage alike. Nowadays, of course, jets flying overhead bring hardly a glance, but an ultralight taking off will bring traffic to its knees. Ultralights really are returned to the simple days of flying, but they incorporate the accumulated knowledge of the past 90 years, from technology to materials. Ultralights take advantage of the unique qualities of chrome moly tubing and wood to aluminum tubing, Dacron, foam, and composite materials. Lumbering out of a backyard airfield like a giant prehistoric bird, ultralights have always seemed an anomaly. They defy categorization, and regulators have had a hard time pigeonholing them. In the early days, as long as ultralights stayed away from and under general aviation traffic, the authorities were satisfied. Logically, ultralight parks grew up in rural areas, away from airport traffic, where they gained local notoriety. The ultralight park operator depends in a large way on the thrill seeker who is looking for the ultimate carnival ride. But the bread and butter comes from the people who have had a long-time love affair with flying, and they sign up for lessons. In the late 60s, time, space, and technology joined in a cosmic union of sorts to create a remarkable flying machine. Hang gliders, fabricated of aluminum tubing and Dacron fabric, bridge the gap between man and his dreams. They embody the essence of flying, riding the breeze, catching thermals, using subtle shifts of the body to control the wind. Man's dream of soaring with the birds was finally realized. But there was a downside: the pilot.
Wind's gusty. Adrenaline's pumping. Give it a second. Steady. Steadier, steady. All right, now. Now. Yee-hoo! Yee-hoo! And away we go. Turbulence, lots of turbulence, but the wind's picking me up. I'm going up high. Got to turn to the right. Bring her around. Got a little tight. Bringing her around. Bringing her around. Oh, going too far. Got to bring her around more. Bring her around. Losing height. Losing height. Picking me up. Picking me up. Oh, shit. Here come the trees. Ah! Oh, God. Nothing broken, I don't think, but what a landing.
It was inevitable that someone would eventually strap a motor and a propeller to his hang glider. Once word got out, the creative process was unleashed. New designs appeared almost daily. Powered hang gliders quickly gave way to weight shift planes with single surface wings and landing gear. These ships were capable of only short duration flights, some which ended prematurely. The problem was that each plane was a new design, and every pilot's first flight was a solo. The planes were so light they were susceptible to the vagaries of the winds, which could and did fool inexperienced pilots. The breakthrough in flight training occurred when the first two-seat ultralights were built. The benefits of having a trained instructor in the same plane as a student are, of course, self-evident, and so ultralight training gained legitimacy. The term ultralight refers to a powered airplane light enough to avoid the regulations of general aviation. By 1983, it was determined that regulations for ultralights were needed. Weight and design restrictions for single-seat planes and two-seat trainers were introduced. By regulation, ultralights were required to be slow speed and user-friendly, but definitely fair-weather flyers. Ground school and minimum in-flight training with an instructor for licensing was required. Obviously, some people needed more training than others. Despite this bad landing, because of the light weight and the slow speed of the machine, there is little risk of injury to the occupants or damage to the airframe. By 1983, the ultralight movement was firmly established. There were close to 300 ultralight manufacturers in North America, each vying for a relatively small market. Part of the appeal of the ultralight industry to manufacturers was the lack of regulation. The field was wide open to anyone who thought he had a better idea. Sometimes that didn't include proper design or flight testing, the consequences of which could be disastrous. But the industry was gaining credibility nonetheless. The accident statistics were remarkably low, and engineering advances in this small field of aviation were being made. Nostalgia plays a large role in the aviation world. Every pilot fantasized as a child about flying the airplanes of bygone days, whether it be an early warplane or a Piper Cub. These would-be barnstormers form a vital niche in the ultralight market. Copycat ultralights pay homage to the flying machines of yesterday. The sophistication and strength of these new machines allows them to perform maneuvers unheard of in earlier models, but full aerobatics are still prohibited. Assembling an ultralight kit is as much a part of the experience as the flying, whether the assembly time is as little as a couple of weekends or hundreds of hours of exacting labor. The experience creates an intimacy between the pilot, which will reap its benefits in the air. Part of the allure is that ultralights can be serviced and maintained by the pilot himself, thus eliminating the cost of hiring a licensed mechanic. But there is the danger of an inexperienced mechanic making a mistake.
When I became involved with ultralights, I was flying 747s at the time. I went from one extreme to the other, 710,000 airplane to a 142-pound airplane. And a lot of people ask me, why do I fly an ultralight as opposed to a conventional airplane? It's more convenient. I can fly it right out of my backyard, which I couldn't do with a conventional airplane. It's not the cost so much. I could afford either one, but I find the ultralight more convenient and more fun to fly. And in 32 years of flying, I probably learned as much about flying ultralights as I have any other airplane, because they are a real airplane. And it requires a certain amount of piloting skill and a little bit of forethought, which some of the other machines seem to have done for you. It's too computerized and too mechanized. Ultralights are very safe to fly, but they do have limitations, and weather is probably the major limitation. That's about the only hazard that I can see people having problems with, is not recognizing the fact that ultralights can't fly in the same kind of weather that a conventional airplane can, especially when it's windy, but also if there's reduced visibility and that sort of thing, people can run into problems. It's a fair weather sport.
Conventional flight training is an expensive proposition. For those who have dreamed of flying, ultralight training offers an inexpensive opportunity to get into the air. Ground school begins with a familiarization session. Pre-flighting an airplane thoroughly is the one most important lesson a student may ever learn. The last place a pilot wants to discover he has a screw loose is in the air.
Follow along the leading edge. Back inside the inspection portal. And here you're looking for bolts that may be coming undone. You're checking for the compression struts done up securely. No breaks or cracks in the wing structure.
Much the same as conventional ground school, classroom time covers rules of the road, meteorology, aerodynamics, and navigation.
Ever since I was a kid, I wanted to learn how to fly. I flew model airplanes, looked at all the books. And the first time I saw an ultralight, some guy was building it in his backyard. He was going to send it over to Africa to be used with his Bible group. The first time I saw an ultralight flying was when I was skiing up at Whistler. It fascinated me somehow, and I knew that I was going to have to learn how to fly. So I checked out the ultralight schools and took a fan flight. The first one was kind of scary. The airplane looked pretty flimsy, but I think it was more the apprehension of just flying in a small plane. Anyway, I signed up for flight lessons. The first couple of lessons, we practiced takeoffs, climbing turns, straight and level flying, and approach to landing where we'd set up the glide angle and Paul would take over the controls just before we landed. The first time I landed on my own, Paul just didn't bother to take over the controls, and after we'd landed he said, "There, Don, you just did your first landing." I really felt that that was a milestone in my training. And after that, we really started practicing circuit patterns, but emphasized landing. I was hanging around the field one day, just watching flyers, when I saw this student approaching for a landing. He was a little short and panicked, pulling back on the stick instead of adding power. He almost stalled the airplane, but he did make a remarkable recovery. For the first time, it made me realize how one little error could have disastrous consequences. The reality is that every time I take an airplane up, there is the possibility that something will go wrong. And as a pilot, it's up to me to make sure that nothing does go wrong. As my training progressed, I started learning emergency recoveries. One of the more advanced maneuvers we learned was the spiral dive. You pull back on the stick, add full aileron and rudder. The inside wing loses lift and suddenly your head snaps and you're pulling about 2 Gs. It scared the hell out of me the first time we did it, but after a couple of times, it got to be kind of fun. Ed, who was operating the camera in the other plane, later told me he got his head caught up in his camera gear and got really panicky as they went vertical to follow us around. It was the only time during the whole shoot that he got scared. The important thing about a spiral dive or a spin is not how to get into one, but how to get out. You can see that I pulled out of the spiral so hard, I almost stalled the plane. Not a good recovery at all. It seems like in flight training, the instructor likes to spring things on you before you have a chance to think about them. We were joining the downwind leg for landing when Paul said, "Have you ever done a dead stick landing before?" And before I had a chance to answer, he had cut the power and we were gliding. Of course, this is designed to prepare a student for an emergency landing, but it's still a thrill to fly an ultralight with the power off. With the engine off, only the wind whistling through the wings can be heard. You suddenly become part of the surroundings instead of just pushing through the air.
Okay, Don, I think it's about time for you to go for your first solo. How do you feel about that?
Well, this is what we've been working on, so I'm ready.
Okay, if you feel all right, I think I'll let you go. It's a nice day. The weather's good. Have you pre-flighted the aircraft yet?
Yeah, I did that a couple minutes ago.
Okay. Now, when you go up there, what I'd like you to do is fly around for a bit. Just get used to the controls, see how the aircraft operates without my weight on board. When you think you're ready, I'd like you to come in around the circuit pattern, do the normal circuit, the landing approach, and
I felt nervous,
and do a landing.
even though I had done all my training and I was ready. So I did all the pre-flight things as I always did them, and by the time I pulled the starter cord, I was calm again.
So,
Clear prop.
So this was it, solo time. I gunned it, gained speed down the field, and took off. Once I was in the air, the first thing I realized was that there wasn't an instructor behind me. It felt like a big mental void as I realized I really was on my own. Exhilaration took over and I had a great time flying around, just doing the things I learned only alone. It was a perfect morning for a solo. The wind was calm, and the air hadn't started to develop any thermals yet. By the time I touched down, I had a grin from ear to ear that just wouldn't go away.
So, Don, how was that?
That was great.
Congratulations.
Thanks,
That's really
Paul.
terrific. I
All
bet
right.
that felt good, eh?
It did. That was great.
Yeah.
Cross-country tripping is the ultimate ultralight adventure. What better way can there be to spend a day or a weekend than flying into a lake? To fish, soak up the sun, or just plain get away from it all. Float-equipped ultralights have added this dimension to the sport. In fact, because of their short takeoff and landing capabilities, ultralights can get in and out of tight places conventional planes might not. The ultralight industry has paralleled the early days of flight in many ways. The simple, carefree, dangerous days of early flight gave rise to tremendous growth in technical sophistication, and more power and speed and greater range. The loss of innocence occurred when government realized it would have to step in to control licensing and regulation. The evolution of the ultralight was fueled by customer demands as well as manufacturers' needs to capture a large piece of a small market. The sophisticated machines which have resulted have forced further regulation as well as escalating prices. In the early 50s, Popular Mechanics magazine envisioned a personal airplane in every suburban home. The advent of the ultralight revitalized the dream. The fascination with flying remains, as can be attested by the huge crowds at every air show. But there is something within the human psyche which tends to keep man firmly attached to the planet. Only a few hardy souls dare to defy some primal fear buried under the layers of civilization. But more pragmatically, the realities of economic survival have made owning and piloting an airplane impossible for most. Many conventional sport pilots have started to explore ultralight parks in search of a lower-cost alternative to the more costly conventional sport flying. As ultralight aircraft have evolved, they have advanced to the point where they meet the expectations of many conventional pilots. There is a sense of freedom, of release from the cares of the earthbound that comes as a bonus to flying. Despite regulations and economic downturns, despite urban sprawl and airspace overcrowding, the ultralight industry survives. Whether in a 30-mile-an-hour single-surface relic or a 100-mile-an-hour sport machine, ultralights offer a safe, exciting way to explore the soul-liberating effects of flying.